I just wanted to ask Peter, what's your explanation for why Jane Jacobs was dropped from the entire curriculum that you were studying at Harvard? And maybe you could just say, I've sort of forgotten what happened when she came to talk at Harvard. There was sort of a dramatic moment, I think.
Let me repeat the question because it might not have registered. And it's a really interesting question. Why was Jane dropped from the curriculum at Harvard? I'm sure it wasn't the only place, but why do you think it was?
You also asked about the 56 conference. So I mean, perhaps I'll start there with that story. It actually begins in around 1955. In 1955, Architectural Forum was planning a big feature issue of the magazine. It was concerned with looking at the American city forward 20 years. And they called it their big city planning issue. So they were gearing up for this already in 1955. And one of the things that was happening at the same time was that William Kirk was trying to spread the message of what was going on up in East Harlem. And he was contacting newspapers, the New York Times, ran a couple of stories. And he was reaching out to magazines and asking them to come up there. Eventually, in the end of 55, early 56, Jacobs made her first trips up to East Harlem, in part because it was seen that it could contribute to this big feature article about city planning and the future of cities. And that's when she made those trips to Harlem and saw what she saw there. And East Harlem was a very important place and had the highest concentration of housing projects anywhere in the U.S. and probably anywhere in the world. So a few months later, Douglas Haskell, her boss, the editor of Architectural Forum, was invited to this among a select group to talk at this 56 conference at Harvard, which was also interestingly called the Harvard Planning Conference. It's now known as the first Harvard Urban Design Conference. But Haskell couldn't go and asked Jane to go. Now, the other part of that backstory is that Haskell already considered her and said as much to her the host at Harvard that she was the best person covering urban renewal and urban redevelopment at the magazine. So she was already understood to be the most knowledgeable about this. So that's part of the reason she went. It wasn't just kind of coincidental, like, well, who's free? We'll just ask Jane. So at the Harvard conference, she told the story of East Harlem. And what's interesting in the way that she interpreted the story was that she already understood it to be a much bigger phenomenon than specific to East Harlem. So there's ways that in looking closely at her writing about East Harlem, one can already see her mind sort of generalizing a situation and understanding this in a much bigger way. So the talk that she gave there was a huge success. So when I was there, I was the archives, the school's archives were downstairs, and I found, for example, in an alumni newsletter that she was one of the highlights of that conference, which again was an invited conference, very select group of people, that was the inauguration of a new degree program, nominally the first degree program in urban design in the country. So that was a big moment, and for example, Lewis Mumford, the best known writer on cities, was there, and among other people, sung her praises. So that was Jane in 56. So fast forward to when I was there, let me go on record as saying I don't think she was dropped from the curriculum. Let's strike that from the record as a kind of enterprise. I think that partly what was going on in the history of that time was that it was I think architectural history, I think kind of all history was less inclusive than it is today in terms of its considerations beyond disciplines and sort of underrepresented minority voices of all different kinds. So it was a time to kind of in the intervening years, I think we've reconsidered. There are a list of other reasons, but I don't want to go on. I think partly it was generational in terms of the people teaching architectural history, the people who were my teachers when I was a student, I would describe them as the generation of '68. So their experiences were not so much within the memory of the 1950s, which had this reputation for being this very dull period of kind of corporate, suburban mentality, which it was not at all. The 60s and the revolution of the social revolutions of '68 were built on what happened, especially in the late 50s. But as I say, historians that were my teachers, I don't think their perspective was so much. They were much more concerned with the '60s.